Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Cuello, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual global healing. And we do this through online interviews and presentations by guest speakers, classes, as well as study groups. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science and consciousness and spirituality and philosophy. We've been doing this for 19 years now. In 2019, we began recording our presentations, and our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. If you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, we really appreciate it if you make a donation or become a member on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Gregg Levoy, author of Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life, that is this book here, and which was rated among the top 20 career publications by the Workforce Information Group, and also Vital Signs, which is this book, The Nature and Nurture of Passion, and is the former behavioral specialist at USA Today and a regular blogger for Psychology Today. He has presented at the Smithsonian Institution, Environmental Protection Agency, National Conference on Positive Aging, Microsoft, American Counseling Association, National Career Development Association, and others, and has appeared on ABC TV, CNN, NPR, and PBS. A former adjunct professor of journalism at the University of New Mexico, former columnist and reporter for USA Today and the Cincinnati Enquirer. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Omni, Psychology Today, Christian Science Monitor, Fast Company, and many others. His website is www.gregglevoy.com. Welcome, Gregg. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
You are most welcome. Thank you, Gloria. So, can we sally forth?
Yes.
All right, let us do that. Thank you again for the invitation and the introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. I really want you guys to walk away with some good hard data from this evening, from your own files, about some of the stories that you tell yourself. So the way I want to go about doing that is I want to just take a little bit of time up front just to set the stage, set the context for what we're going to do hands-on, which is the majority of the time we'll spend together today. This will be the only time I'm going to hold forth during the seminar, but the rest of the time is very participatory. But I want to take a little bit of time, maybe 15, 20 minutes or so up front, and just share some of the ideas that the work is based on. And then I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of really nosy personal questions. And I'm going to ask you to do some writing and do some sharing, so we can just drill down a little bit into this notion of the stories we tell ourselves. So without further ado, let me jump in. 3 years ago, I moved from Asheville, North Carolina to Santa Cruz, California. A decision that was complicated by the fact that my twin brother lives in Santa Cruz and has for 40 years. And moving to his town would not only run afoul of our long-standing policy that there ain't no town big enough for the two of us, meaning we need our own turf. But I figured it would certainly trouble the ghost of our mother, who instilled that taboo in us, started that story going with her insistence pretty much from the day we were born that we were going to have separate identities. So there was no Ron and Don stuff. We had separate bedrooms, separate classrooms in school. We had to take up different instruments, different hobbies, go to different summer camps, and even for a while, different bus stops. Different bus stops. But when I told my brother Ross about my interest in considering Santa Cruz as a place to relocate, and I shared my concern with him about violating this lifelong taboo, he initially shrugged it off. He said, 15 years ago, I would probably have agreed, but I'm over it. And then one day, during a month-long experiment in dating Santa Cruz, in other words, living there for a month to see if it was actually a fit, I went into the grocery store around the corner from his house, the one he frequents. And when the cashier asked if I wanted a receipt, and I said yes, she said, "Really? You never want a receipt." And so I got to say to her something I say a lot since I moved to Santa Cruz a few years ago. I'm not who you think I am. And I love the look on their faces. And this happens pretty much on a weekly basis and has for several years because he knows everybody. I said, I'm not who you think I am. I'm his twin brother, and I'm not pulling your leg. And I'm the twin who always wants a receipt. So later that same day, Ross walked into the same grocery store, just independently of me, stood in the same checkout line, same cashier said, "Oh, I saw your other half today," not realizing what a loaded remark that is for a twin, okay? And that day, Ross said, that night, he said to me, he had the first of a number of nightmares about the prospect of me moving to his town, featuring in various dreams an avalanche, a mudslide, and in one dream, a Tyrannosaurus Rex tearing up the town. So it turns out he was not over it. And nor really was I. And this was not surprising because the prohibition against living in the same town was among the longest standing stories of our life together. And we were not going to just edit it out without some backlash. But the only way to grow beyond that story and even consider the prospect of living in the same town was to confront that story and to hash it out together and separately, which we did over the next year or so. The fact is, we all, I think, have stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how it is and what's possible, what we're capable of, why we succeed or fail, what we can expect from life. And I think we do this because we're storytelling animals, and we create stories to help us make sense of life, to figure things out, to give us a framework for making decisions, okay? And sometimes those stories can turn against us, especially the negative or the constricting stories, like I'm not the creative type, or I'm powerless to change the world, or I'm a victim, or vulnerability is weakness, or people are untrustworthy, or 1,000 others, really. And they become self-limiting, these kinds of stories, when they run up against what I think of as life's primary agenda, which is to grow. And if you happen to have a belief in God or anything related to that, any similar belief, and you have a belief that we are expressions of God and therefore sacred and worthy, this is going to undermine that belief. These kinds of stories are going to undermine that, right? And this is especially true if the stories you're telling yourself, and we're going to deconstruct some of these during this seminar, if they happen to be lies of identity. Okay, I am what I do. I am what I have. I am what other people think of me. Okay, though these are not just big stories like lies of identity. Anytime you catch yourself having a strong reaction to something or someone, like sudden anger or irrational fear, or sudden defensiveness, you're probably dealing with a story that's become so internalized and unconscious, you don't really even hear it anymore. All right. Like somebody makes a casual remark and it unconsciously reminds you of something your father used to say to you, and you're just off to the races. You're not even really seeing things as they are anymore, but as they were. And you're probably stuck inside of a story that's just going to keep on repeating itself unless you confront it. All right. And hash it out. All right. Quick note, this is not to say that there aren't some, quote, negative stories that are really important to tell. Okay. One example among many I can think of is the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were set up in South Africa after apartheid, and how critical they were to the justice and the healing that happened there when the victims of apartheid got a chance to very publicly tell their stories of victimization at the hands of that regime. All right. So I just want to note that there are some kinds of negative stories that are really important to tell. Okay. But this isn't just about old stories either. We are, I think, constantly making up stories about what we think is going on around us. All right. What somebody is thinking. What a friend meant by a remark. What a symptom means. All right. What a failure says about us. All right. We're constantly making up stories. Anytime you hear yourself say you should do something, you're probably dealing with a story of some kind. Anytime you hear a thou shalt not in the back of your head, it's probably a story. And certainly anytime you refer to the story of my life, this is something we usually utter in exasperation, isn't it? This is a kind of a statement of pessimism, like, ugh, that's the story of my life. Needless to say, that's a story, whatever that is. And they're not just personal, all right? They're cultural. Big boys don't, or nice girls don't. These are gender stories that can haunt your individual life, as are cultural narratives like go to school, graduate, get a job, get married, have kids, retire. Okay? So this could be a template that people use to help them create a life. But it could also punish anybody who deviates from it, or create kind of unrealistic expectations around pursuit of the American dream. Okay. Needless to say, stories are also handed down to us from our spiritual traditions. Okay. Maybe more to the point, the religious education that many of us got before perhaps we discovered organizations like Caritas, so I'm thinking of, for instance, the commandments listed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, collectively referred to as the law. All right. There are 613 of them. All right. And they include things like do not marry outside your religion. Okay. Or create no artistic representations of God, meaning that the painting that Michelangelo did on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you know, this one, blasphemy, according to that storyline. All right. I remember this one. Follow not the whims of your own heart. This would pretty much put me out of business, you know, being the author of a book on callings. No tattoos, no blowing on dice, no working on the Sabbath. I mean, good luck with that one anymore. No rebelling against your parents. And here's one of my favorite ones. No trying God's patience. You know, like show of hands. How many of you have ever tried God's patience? I mean, seriously. So whether the stories we tell ourselves are personal or, you know, transpersonal, a story is a box. I think a story is a box. And when you identify with the story to the point of feeling stuck or cramped or spellbound, you're inside the box. But once you start to stop identifying with the story or even question the story, you're outside the box. And not that this is easy. I mean, I want to give a generous tip of the hat. This is not easy to change these storylines, all right? To step outside the box, no less question it. You know, stories are powerful, is my point. Stories are powerful and they shape our lives because stories become beliefs, become behaviors. Okay. Or as some people who believe in the manifestational arts will tell you, thoughts become experience. Okay. If you're familiar with any of the New Thought churches like Unity or Church of Religious Science, they're very firmly based on this idea. Thoughts become experience. So if you have these storylines going, they're going to play themselves out in the real world. All right. In other words, stories don't just, you know, we don't just tell stories, they tell us. They tell us what we think, who we think we are, what we think we're capable of. And every telling rubs it in, I think, a little bit more deeply. And especially when they are the negative or the constrictive stories, you know, and they're a kind of a narrowing down and they just simply, they're too small for us. I think many of these stories are simply too small for us. Now, expanding them, and therefore our lives, I think, starts with catching them in the act. You know, starting to notice the stories at all. There's a guy I ran across named Dan McAdams. He belongs to a branch of psychology called narrative therapy, which is specifically designed to help people interrupt their storylines, change their storylines. He says, and this is how he languages it, you need to interrogate yourself about the stories you tell. Interrogate, okay? And stop letting them have their way with you, essentially. And I think one way to do that is, as my mother used to say to me occasionally, watch your language, okay? In other words, listen to how you talk to yourself. Start to really turn on that receiver and listen to the stories you tell. Listen to the tone of voice you use with yourself and the things you say, and imagine how you would feel if somebody else were telling you some of the stories you're telling yourself. You're not the creative type. It would have a very different feel than if you say, oh, I'm not the creative type. Very different feel, you know? And needless to say, the process of catching these stories and listening to the language we use is helped along a lot if you have anything resembling a mindfulness practice, okay, a spiritual practice, meditation, journaling, dream work, dream interpretation, therapy for that matter. I remember a therapist said to me once, after I had shared with him one of my favorite sob stories about how my family of origin had victimized me, he said, "So how many times have you told that story? How many more times are you planning on telling it?" He said. Okay. So there are mentors and there are tormentors. And he was one of those. And because we're always making up new stories, it really pays to watch how you craft them, how you get them going. Okay. McAdams says that people, for instance, who tell stories about challenging events in their life, but with a redemptive twist, in other words, something you learned from that experience, some wisdom or insight you managed to wrest from it, some way it helped you to grow, they thrive more over the course of their lives than people who tell negative stories about challenging events. Okay. When I lost a newspaper job early in my career, I just labeled it a failure, and that was the story I told about it. But over time, I realized that it was by getting fired from that job that I gained precisely the motivation I needed to finally act on a calling to quit my job as a journalist and become a freelance writer, which I'd been ignoring for half a decade at that point. Okay. So I was, by focusing on the redemptive twist in this story, I was able to turn it from a story of failure, flat out failure, to, if not quite a story of success, at least a story of falling up. Does that, you kind of get that intuitively, what I mean by that? Falling up. All right. I think Joseph Campbell called it a directive crisis. All right. I guess the rest of us just call it turning lemons into lemonade. But we're, in other words, not just the protagonists of our stories. We're the narrators. We're in charge of the stories. All right. So a couple more things before I loose the hounds. It is imperative to separate fact from fiction in the stories that we tell ourselves. Separate fact from fiction. Okay. We're going to do a little bit of that. For instance, my parents divorced when I was 9 might be a fact. In my case, it was a fact. It's my fault is a fiction. All right. My father was critical and emotionally absent. Might be a true story. Again, yes. But I'm unworthy of love is a false story. Okay. There ain't no town big enough for the two of us might once have been true, but no longer is. All right. So you need, I think, to ask yourself whether a story that you're telling yourself is true and how true. How true. Because even a shred of contrary evidence, a minor exception to the storyline, a small crack in its logic, another way it could be told from another point of view might give you that all-important shadow of a doubt that can help unhook you from the storyline and from the limitations you put on yourself by repeatedly telling it. Okay. I have, for example, made a regrettable number of life decisions that started and ended with the phrase, "I can't afford it. I can't afford it," which just grinds into my subconscious a message of self-imposed limitation. Okay. This is a rap on the knuckles of the cookie jar, really. What's more accurate is I won't afford it. All right. Which adds into the equation the critical elements of choice and power. Okay. I would prefer to spend my money on car repairs rather than a new computer. All right. Big difference, right? All right. Let's say you have a story, as a lot of people apparently do, that you're not the creative type. All right. But under scrutiny, you begin to notice exceptions to this story, right? You go out into the garden, you cut some flowers and you arrange them in a vase with the purples in the back and the yellows in the front and the blues in the middle. You're being artistic, right? You sing along with the car radio. You are singing. You doodle when you're talking to your dad on the phone. You're drawing. You know, you drum on your desk. You're drumming. When you dream, your subconscious is essentially playwriting. All right. So then you suddenly might realize, I am the creative type and I need to amend this story. Okay. But again, no easy thing. You're not going to undo stories you may have been telling yourself for the better part of a lifetime at the flick of a switch. You won't be able to do that. And without some blowback. Okay. Changing stories is likely to ruffle feathers, yours as well as perhaps other people's. Okay. So I think I'm gonna skip ahead just a touch, and I just want to say that it was by beginning to notice the story that me and my brother were telling ourselves about there ain't no town big enough for the two of us, that we were able to confront that story and move through it. All right. But we had to really had some hard conversations, share some vulnerable stuff, talk about our childhoods, imagine scenarios. We had to hash it out in order to move forward. But I think that until we begin to notice the stories that we tell ourselves and confront, if not deconstruct, the core perceptions at the heart of those stories, the behavior that grows out of them isn't going to change. Okay. Again, it was only by dialoguing with myself and with my brother that we were able to move past the story. And now we live in the same town for the first time since we were boys. And I have to tell you, it is one of the great new joys of both of our lives. All right. So the growth that has happened by confronting that story has been monumental for both of us. It's really having my best friend living in the same town with me. So in the spirit of upgrading the stories that we tell ourselves, identifying them, upgrading them, and of course, having compassion for ourselves as we do this, what I want to offer you now is a series of questions that are hopefully designed to kind of flush up some of the stories you may be telling yourself at this juncture in your life, and whether they're serving you or not, what might need editing, you know, how you can move through the story and change it, and hopefully find whatever's on the other side of that story or a new one entirely. All right. So what I want you to do is either grab pen and paper or open up a new window on your computer where you can do some writing. Okay. And toggle back and forth between that document and the Zoom session. And again, I want you to respond to the questions. There's maybe 6 or 8 or so questions. And then after each one of them, we're going to open it up to do some sharing. So I really encourage you to share anything you feel comfortable sharing about your discoveries as we go through. All right. So also, I encourage you to use the chat box. If you have questions, you can address it to the group. You can address it just to me. You can make comments on other people's shares. You can suggest books. You can just use it. It's one of the nice things about Zoom sessions compared to classroom sessions. You're allowed to pass notes. So I figure we might as well take advantage of that. And when you share, you know, unmute, share, and if you can remember to mute again, that would be great. I did a Zoom session last year where a woman had a cage full of really noisy birds right behind her, and she kept forgetting to mute herself, and it started to feel like kind of like a Hitchcock movie after a while. So I'm just going to ask you to try to remember to mute. All right, so Here's the first section. This is just about identifying some stories that you may be telling yourself, okay? And what I want to do is just prime the pump to give you a sense of what exactly I'm asking for here. And I'm going to prime the pump by just listing a half a dozen stories from my own files, just bullet points, really. And now these are stories I have told myself for anywhere from a decade to a half a century, okay? And which I've outgrown to one degree and another, okay? So many of these represent, for me, some success stories, all right? Not just the one I told you about with my twin brother, but here's another one I told myself for 10 years. I am a high-touch, low-tech presenter, and I don't do online teaching, okay? Pandemic cured me of that. It only took 10 years and a plague to finally get me over that story. Here's another one. I'm a lone wolf. I've told myself that since my 20s. I'm a lone wolf, okay? Another, I don't sing in public, okay? Another story, I don't cook, I thaw, okay? Another story, I have to work at a desk. I can't write, I can't think in a coffee house or in a van on the road or traveling. I have to have a desk and a desktop. And I told myself that forever, all right? And one more, I do not have the intestinal fortitude to invest in the stock market, despite the fact my mother's a stockbroker. And frankly, at the moment, I wish I wasn't in the stock market. So just wanted to brainstorm that a bit to give you a sense of the kinds of stories. So what I just want you to do is take a couple of minutes and just brainstorm some stories that you hear in your head as you go about your life. Just anything that seems relevant to you now. Just write down a list. What are some of the stories you tell yourself? And just in really bullet points, short sentences. Go. Why don't you take another minute? All right. So, as promised, let's open it up. I encourage anybody who just wants to share one story or three or four. Just what are some of the stories you wrote down that you hear yourself saying?
Let me remind the audience that you need to have your video on if you want to speak. But if you don't want your video on and you want to say something, put it in the chat and I will be happy to read it. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'm going to start quickly because I think I'm going to say something that I think is relatively common. But I always say in business settings, and sometimes not, I'm not the smartest person in the room.
Oh, interesting. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're gonna drill down and as we go along here into some of how that feels and some of what that does. So thank you for that one. That's a great one. Yeah, Jane.
I have one that says I'm not good at running, which is so funny because I really want to be a runner, or like it's like I have this desire to be good at that thing, but then I also have this thought that like I'm not good at it. So it's like I can see the contradiction in real time.
Yeah, got it. Okay. So I'm not good at running, even though I want to run. Okay, that's great. A few others. Let's hear some more. Name some stories that you hear yourself tell.
There aren't enough hours in the day.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who was that just sharing?
That was me.
Oh, yes.
There aren't enough hours in the day.
Oh, yeah. There aren't
Always
enough.
running out of time. Too much to do.
Right.
So many books, so little time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a book out there. I think the title is 4,000 Weeks. It's a book about the fallacy of time management. You might Google it. I think it's something like 4,000 Weeks. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, Janice.
So mine also has to do with time. I never have enough time for myself.
Oh, okay.
And and another one is that my life is complicated, so people don't really get me, even my own family.
Oh, okay. My life is complicated, so people don't get me. They don't understand me, even my family. Okay, good. Thank you. Those are juicy. One or two more. Anybody else?
I'll add another one.
Yeah, sure.
I'm very organized, but I can never get ahead of it all.
Oh, boy. I'm very organized, but I can never get ahead of it all. Aha. Yeah, that's good. So, for what it's worth, you might appreciate this. I made a very revealing Freudian slip not too long ago. I had gone on the road at a time when I had a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of projects I was juggling and fires I was needing to put out, and apparently more stressed out about that than I was aware. What I meant to say on the outgoing message of my answering machine before I left on this trip was, hello, this is Gregg Levoy. I'll be out of the office until August 25th. But what I said instead, and didn't find out until I got back, was, hello, this is Gregg Levoy. I'll be out of control until August 25th. And explain some of the messages that were waiting for me when I got home. So
That's great.
I can appreciate that one, Frank. Thank you. All right, here's another question. I'm sorry, did I just miss somebody raise their hand?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of mine is I'll never be able to overcome my OCD and perfectionism enough to be successful.
Okay, I'll never be able to overcome my OCD and perfectionism enough to be successful. Ooh, okay, that's compelling. Great, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Okay, another question. This next piece is about how that story, or how some of the stories you tell yourself actually feel inside of you when you believe they're true. Okay, so don't get cracking on this yet. Again, I want to prime the pump. I want to tell you a little bit about how one of the stories that I have been telling myself for much of my life, how I feel about that story. And it's the story about being a lone wolf. On one hand, I have a certain cussed pride in being a rugged individualist, a do-it-yourselfer, independent, proud of myself for succeeding as a freelance writer, for having healthy boundaries in relationships, relatively healthy boundaries, and for having a high threshold for my own company. In other words, not afraid of solitude, okay? That's partly how I feel about this lone wolf thing on one hand. On the other hand, the story about being a lone wolf feels a little sad, makes me feel a little sad and lonesome. Partly because it doesn't capture my longing to belong, you know, my hunger for connection with people. And sometimes even feels like a bit of an excuse for my fear of dependency on other people and my fear of vulnerability, okay? So with that, I want to turn this over to you. I want you to pick one of the stories that were on the list that you just created. Just pick one that feels like it's got some juice for you right now, that's relevant for you right now at this juncture of your life. Pick one and just jot a few sentences about how that story makes you feel in here when you believe that it's true, okay? That you're never going to get over your perfectionism enough to be successful, or you're not the smartest person in the room, or there's never enough time in the day to get done what you want to get done. Whatever the story happens to be, pick one, write a sentence or two about how it makes you feel when you believe it's the truth. Again, why don't you take another minute? Hey, Sharon. Sharon, who's the four-legged?
This is Cooper.
Cooper.
I've been gone all day, so he has to,
Oh boy.
he's like glue with me. Yeah.
Oh. I can't quite see him from here. Has he got Jack Russell in him?
I think he might have some, he's got mostly Chihuahua, but he's big for a Chihuahua. He's got long legs.
Anyway.
Yeah. He won't get off me.
All
He's a
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's open it up once again. Anybody feel like sharing a little bit about how it feels to you when you believe that the story you've chosen to focus on is true? Anybody want to say a few words about what comes up? I remember when I was starting up my freelance career. Now, this doesn't involve a team. If any of you have ever been self-employed, you probably know about this already, how scary it can be out there on your own. But I remember wanting to grow it faster than some people thought I should. And I even went to my mentor and I asked him, should I ask my grandmother for my inheritance early so that she can watch me enjoying it and growing my business faster? He said, do not rob yourself of the good, hard human work of building it organically from the ground up. Don't try to go for a quick fix. And shortly after that, he gave me a book, and it is the only book I have ever read 5 times. And it's a book called Transitions. It's a book about how people, Transitions is written by William Bridges. And it's a book about how people make change. And you gotta love a book about transitions written by a guy named Bridges. His take on how people make change is in 3 stages. Stage 1 is endings. All right. Stage 1 is ending. Something is ending. Stage 3 is new beginnings. The reason I have gone back to the book 5 times at 5 turning points in my life is because of the middle section. He calls it the neutral zone. All right. Now, I'm not suggesting you're necessarily in a neutral zone, but there's a slow building phase before it, maybe it pops or it becomes what you want it to become, goes public perhaps, but there's this slow phase of in-betweenness that can feel like a holding pattern. For some people can feel like a stuck place, but Bridges makes a really elegant case for why it is so important to submit yourself to this growing, building, noodling, sometimes not even knowing what's going to happen phase that everybody, myself included, hate. Reminds me of too much of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours thing. Remember that? Mastery in any field of endeavor requires a minimum of 10,000 hours of dedicated practice. That's 90 minutes a day for 20 years. I just want to skip ahead to the part where I'm awesome, And so but Bridges makes a really good case for how important it is to the new beginnings that you submit yourself to this phase of discovery and experimentation and failure. I'm a big fan of that book and that notion. Some others, anybody want to share a little bit about how you feel when you believe the story you're telling is true? Yes, Janice, and then Sharon.
Sure. So when I tell myself, when I believe that I never have enough time for myself, it makes me feel depleted and tired, gives me anxiety. I feel sort of like this, like never-ending longing, because it's something I feel like I wanted. If I could just have some time for myself to process this thing, then maybe I could do this other thing. But that's, what's standing in my way. It makes me feel frustrated um, because I'm spending time helping maybe other people, but then what about myself?
Uh-huh.
Um, and then it also sometimes makes me feel worried about my future, because I think, well, if I don't have enough time for myself now, how will I ever be a good parent?
Ah, okay. And parenting is in the future for you?
Mhm.
It's not present. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I just got invited to do a presentation for school social workers. And I do a lot of presentations in the arenas of human services. And this is so common that people, because these are the types, and maybe you fit this description too, they're givers. They're people who like to be of service. They want to help the world. They want to change the world. And so they're giving and giving and giving. And the self-care piece is often left off of, the planning board. And it's one of the contributing factors in burnout is the lack of balance there. I really feel for the people in human services, because it's so compelling, and these people have so much compassion, and they need to care for themselves, because of obviously the caregiver's not caring for the caregiver. Things are going to get out of balance pretty quickly. So I definitely hear what you're saying. Thank you for sharing that, Janice. Sharon. I think you have to unmute.
It's hard with the dog on the. Now, is that good?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a common theme, I think, tonight. One of my things was, I guess I'm just here to serve others. What I want doesn't really matter. I have no idea what I would do if I could do anything. I have no idea what that would be.
Oh, wow. Wow. So I'm here to serve others. It doesn't really matter what I want or what I need. And what was the last piece of that?
If I could choose something I wanted to do, I wouldn't even know what that might be.
Wouldn't even know where to begin.
No.
Wow.
And so what that makes me feel like is unseen, unheard, small, limited, directionless, and taken advantage of.
Oh, boy. Boy, that's quite a shit list.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that one. All right. Again, we are going to unpack some of these as we go along here. Anybody else? One more? How you feel about one of these stories, if you believe it's true? Going. Okay, another section. This is a little bit about consequences, okay? The story I have told myself for a decade, at least pre-pandemic, that I'm a high-touch, low-tech presenter and I don't do webinars, cost me a lot of work because I always turned down the opportunities, and I had dozens of them over the decade to do online teaching. And again, this is before the pandemic even happened. I always turned them down because I just didn't want to do them. I didn't think they were viable. I grossly underestimated Zoom and its ilk. And so when the pandemic hit the fan, I was pretty ill prepared to do the Zoom thing. And because I had avoided it for a decade, and I had a very steep learning curve in getting up and running on it. It took me a lot longer than it should have and could have. And a lot of internal resistance to get over, okay? So what I want you to do is describe some of the consequences to you of this storyline, how it's impacted you, all right? Not even just how you feel, but practically speaking, how it's impacted you, that you have this story about yourself. And it can include positive and negative impacts, but write down a few, see what comes up. What have the consequences been of this particular storyline in your life? I should take another moment or two. All righty. So anybody inclined to weigh in on what impact this storyline has had in your life that you're aware of? Anybody want to share? I think, Gloria, you need to unmute.
Yes, I do. Please remember to have your video on if you want to speak. And I have two chats that I'd like to read. One is from Sam to everyone, and she's addressing Sharon. Thank you for sharing, Sharon. That really resonates, Sam said. And then Calandra said, that resonates for me too, Sharon, probably for many of us here. People used to ask me what my hobbies were, and between being a mother and an entrepreneur, I had no idea I even was allowed to have hobbies. To some extent, that's still true today, but I'm working on it.
Wow. Thank you, Gloria. And Calandra and Sam.
Mm-hmm.
So who might be inclined to share some impacts? Anybody want to unmute and share what consequences have happened as far as you're aware from this particular storyline?
Well, I can share.
Great.
So
tell us the story that you've chosen to work on.
there aren't enough hours in the day.
Ah, yes.
And so when I believe this is true, I feel overwhelmed and as though I'm not getting enough done. And I remind myself that Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt and many others whom I admire had the same number of hours in each day. That thought makes me actually hopeful. Because look what they did, right? With the number of hours. The consequences is that what I do is I work with priorities. So I think, what is the top priority for me to get done today? And then if I get that done, then what's the next priority, that kind of thing. I accept the fact that I may not get to do all that I want, but I get to do a lot of what I love, which makes me feel grateful until the next time I get overwhelmed.
Okay.
But, yeah. Yeah.
And do you mind me asking how often is that sense of overwhelm?
Well, it kind of, I think there are times when I feel it, and I guess it's that's a good question, because I think I always feel like an undercurrent of it, but then other times it just feels more overwhelming.
Yeah.
I always feel like, oh, I'm not getting enough done. And then other times but what I've learned from doing the Byron Katie work, you're probably familiar with that.
Yes, right.
Is that when I start to feel really overwhelmed, that's when I need to pull back, which sounds counterintuitive.
Yep.
But that's exactly what works for me. Is I need to pull back because I'm just not, I'm not able to see things clearly when I'm in that state, and I'll do something stupid.
Yeah. This reminds me, I did something very similar to this recently. The pandemic, because I'm essentially in the business of public gatherings, all of that went the way of the dodo bird during the pandemic. And And of course, the income that went along with that. And so
Yeah.
financial anxiety was suddenly in the foreground, as opposed to you said, like an undercurrent.
Mhm.
It went from being an undercurrent to being an overcurrent.
Mm.
And one of the things that I did to help myself cope with that is everybody was telling me to trust the universe, which is one of those spiritual adages that on one hand triggers my intellectual gag reflex, but on the other hand has a long and noble lineage. Let go and let God, trust the process, have faith, thy will be done, all that. So one of the things that I did is I rearranged my morning schedule to now include an act of trust, rather than just an abstract idea of it, like trust the universe. I bundled into my morning 15 minutes of playing the piano. Okay, I noticed that Maria has a lovely piano. It looks like a grand in the background. Yeah, okay. 15 minutes of playing the piano before I came in here into the office to work. And partly I did that to prove to myself that I could afford the time to do that. Okay. And that was one of those counterintuitive decisions. And that's actually one of the diagnostics I now use to tell myself when I'm actually trusting the universe, is when I make a counterintuitive decision like that one. Respond to fear with surrender rather than striving all the time, which is my go-to. It's my default, right? And my family's default. And frankly, my gender's default, but to choose passion over security sometimes, to try to allow things to happen rather than always having to make them happen, as in make money, make an income, make a living, make headway, make a difference. So these counterintuitive decisions of allowing when I'm under stress rather than going to the to-do list mindset is one of those acts of trust that tell me I'm actually trusting the universe. I don't just have a high opinion of myself, So your comment reminds me of that.
Yeah. When I realized that what I needed to do was pull back, it reminded me of when I was 10 years old. I almost drowned in Copacabana Beach in Brazil. I was with my cousins, my adult cousins, on the beach, and I went out thinking, I'm such a good swimmer because I used to swim in a pool, and they had warned me about the undertow and the waves and everything, but I thought, oh, I'm a good swimmer. So I went out, and I saw this big wave coming, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna just jump right into it like I've seen on TV. And when it did, it just, churned me around, took me out, and I couldn't see which way was up. And finally, I couldn't hold my breath anymore, and I was struggling, but I didn't know which way to struggle. And I let my breath out, knowing that this was it. I was going to die. I knew I couldn't take another breath. And at that point, I had this very euphoric experience where I just felt like, oh, it's okay. And there was this incredible peace, which of course you wouldn't expect, but that's what happened. I had this incredible peace. And I knew it was fine. I knew I was going to die, and I knew it was fine. It was very interesting. And with that, I relaxed. And as I relaxed, I guess I must have floated up or something, because I opened my eyes and I could see daylight, and I knew which way to go, and I got out.
Wow.
And out of that experience, well, two things. I remember sitting on the beach with my cousins, whom, of course, I didn't tell them what had happened. And I allowed myself to, I was just shaking all over at that point. Once I, got my adrenaline going again and got out, then I was shaking, and I thought, that's okay. They think I'm cold. They're not going to catch on. And I thought, but out of that, when I was doing, many years later, I was doing this book on your personal myth, identifying personal myths.
Mm.
And I realized that out of that experience, I developed a myth that said, when things are really out of control, when things are really chaotic and I feel like I have no control over them, the thing to do is relax.
Mm.
Because
Talk
that's
about
what they do.
reframing a story. It
Yeah,
seems
and I
very
didn't even
counterintuitive.
realize, I didn't realize I had that myth until I was an adult doing this work and I identified it. And the other thought I had at the time was, I'll never be afraid of drowning because it's so peaceful.
Mm.
Yeah.
Ah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. But
Interesting.
anyway, so
Yeah.
so I'm with you. You have to, I think when we get bottled up, that's when we have to relax.
Mm. Well, one from the easier said than done file, but I agree.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes it is.
Anybody else want to share any impacts to the storyline? At least the ones you can identify? Yes, Janice.
Sure, I will. So when some of the consequences of believing that I don't have enough time for myself, and then letting myself feel the worry or frustration of that, is that sometimes that can make me have a short temper, and maybe I might actually express that to the very person I gave my time to,
Oh,
and therefore
Oh.
undermining the good deed I did.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got sort of an immediate feedback loop there. When you're giving too much, you start to get perhaps impatient. And you're giving with one hand and taking with another to the same individual. Aha, that's a good little piece of biofeedback right there.
Mhm.
Anything else you want to share about it?
Yeah, I think also sometimes I can give into that feeling of like, if I give into the feeling of not having enough time, then because it makes me feel depleted, that actually sometimes when I do have time, I make a choice, not maybe consciously, but I'll choose to sort of, I'm giving up that, like, it doesn't occur to me like, oh, this would be a good hour that I could spend, or 2 hours I could spend reflecting or spending time by myself. And instead, maybe I might give into escapism, whether it's binging a bad TV show or something that's not necessarily the productive time I want to be spending with myself.
I see. So time for myself, in your mind, doesn't include things like binging on TV. You want it to be productive, self-care kinds of things.
I think so. Yeah.
That's what you mean by me time.
Me time. Yeah, like really spending time with myself, where it's not an afterthought or something I feel like I'm stealing time away from something else.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Because there is just the R&R aspect of sitting down in front of a good TV show. I mean, sure. You're kind of off duty. Yeah. I mean, I see. I hear what you're saying about television. It's not quite as productive as you want to be with it, but it might also serve a function as well.
Well, and I'm also currently I'm in film school, so I'm like just supposed to critically think about everything I see. So it's a little bit.
I see. Oh, so now TV is research.
Right. Exactly. Now it's work.
Very clever.
I can relate to that because I do that all the time. I watch a show and then I think, God, I just wasted all this time. I can totally relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. I'm shocked to have calculated at some point the amount of time I spent in the first 18 years of my life in front of a television set, because my parents gave each one of the kids a TV instead of parenting. And so we were just in front of it all the time. And it was the babysitter. And so as soon as I left home, I got rid of the television, and I don't think I ever watched it again, except when I'm in a hotel room. And then I binge. It's interesting. I can go through 4 or 5 hours of television in a row and end up feeling the same way you just described, Frank. It's like, my goodness, what did I just do that for? In any case, it's instructive for me because it shows me that at least in that particular arena, I have addictive qualities. I don't generally, but that's one of the ones that I do. In fact, my ex-wife, when I would be watching a screen in an airport, and they're everywhere in the airports, I would suddenly see this in front of my face. She'd say, you go into a kind of a trance when you're in front of a screen with moving figures on it.
Yeah.
All right.
I have a couple of chats to read.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay. So Kara said to everyone, and they took naps.
Einstein. That was maybe after your comment about Einstein and.
Oh, and they took
Eleanor
naps.
Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And they took naps.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
we call them power naps.
Yeah, well, and I do too. Sometimes if I get really sleepy and I can't work because I'm falling over, I take a nap. Okay, and then Lorraine said, I can give time challenges too. I repeat my mantra, I have enough time to do what needs to be done. Yeah. And then Kara said, grind. This is following Frank's comment, I think. She said, grind culture conditions us to feel guilty about relaxing or resting. And
Right.
Kalandra said, yes, Kara, that's so true.
Yeah.
And Lorraine said, oh, typo correct. I can have time challenges. Yes, I got that. And then Kara sent a link to everyone. I don't know what it is.
Podcast.
No More Grind, How to Finally Rest with Trisha Hershey. I don't know. Really good podcast on the subject. So you can get that in the chat.
Yeah. That's
And
great.
Janice said she loves that podcast. Okay.
Great. Thank you guys for weighing in on that. All right. So here's the next piece I want you to take a peek at. This is about the question of, is it true? And to what degree is it true or not? All right. So let me prime the pump again. I ran across recently a fascinating article in National Geographic that described that the ancient Greek and Roman marble sculptures that populate the world's museums were not originally white. They were, it turns out, richly painted with colors, almost all of them. White is just all that was left after they'd, kind of gone through time's stomach acids. White is just all that was left. But they were painted with colors. And I mention this because the introduction of new evidence, in this case, complements of infrared photography and electron microscopes, changed the story that we tell. All right, the introduction of new evidence changed the story. And I think the same goes for some of the stories we tell ourselves. All right, for instance, the lone wolf story. Okay, science has turned my mind around on that one entirely, because it turns out there is no such thing in the natural world as a lone wolf. It's a complete fiction, doesn't exist. There's only two categories of wolves that you'll ever find alone out there. One of them is a young male who leaves the pack to start his own pack, okay? And the other is an older female who's driven out of the pack by a young breeding male, okay? But in either case, it's not because wolves prefer to be alone, all right? And so this simple fact from the biological literature has helped me reframe this whole story for myself, that I or anybody else is a lone wolf, all right? So just literally science has helped me unravel that story, all right? Here's another one. I've had a story for really about as long as I can remember, that I'm not an activist, all right? As in action on behalf of social issues. I'm not an activist. I don't volunteer for things. I don't spearhead initiatives. Half the time I feel like I'm never doing enough for the world and I'm lazy and fiddling while Rome burns. Okay. And I've beaten myself up with that storyline for a really long time. I should be more of an activist. And then one day I sat down and with a piece of paper and a pencil, and I just made a list of anything I could remember, as far back as I could remember, that I'd ever done that demonstrated my involvement in any kind of a social cause. And I came up with quite a list, starting with remembering for the first time in probably 40 years that in high school, I went door to door to door selling light bulbs to raise money for the very first Earth Day in 1970. I have no idea why light bulbs, but there you have it. But I did that, and I remembered that I did that. I participated in an anti-war march when I was in college, would have been Vietnam, volunteered in a soup kitchen one Christmas, spent a year volunteering at a local dog pound, sent a letter to the editor of Newsweek magazine once, protesting an article that they had written where they referred to the American Navy as plying the oceans and the Russian Navy as prowling the oceans. And I cried foul. All right. And a number of other things, including, giving apples out to homeless people. And discovering the hard way that about 50% of them can't do apples. Never dawned on me. Teeth, they can't do apples. So now if I do it again, it'll be bananas or something, oranges. But anyway, suddenly there I was after having compiled that list, realizing I have been an activist. Knock it off already. Really, knock it off. Sometimes it's been appropriate throughout my self-development to confront myself in a certain way. I'm a big believer in compassion, but I'm also a big believer in telling myself to knock it off when it's appropriate to say, stop already, just stop. Because you know how the mind can obsess over things. And you can just allow that to happen. And sometimes I've needed, and this was an example of saying to myself, stop already with the story that you're not an activist and you're fiddling while Rome burns. I mean, how melodramatic is that? So expanding the story to those kind of dimensions doesn't do me any good. So my point is that, the stories that we tell ourselves are sometimes based on outmoded data or outdated data or false assumptions or other people's storylines or, and growing up in a family full of scientists, I know that it's just bad science to not change a story when new evidence demands it, not to change your hypothesis when new evidence is presented. All right. So,
Greg,
yes,
I would submit that the work that you do is very much activism, because I go through the same things sometimes. I'm not doing enough. There's climate crisis. I'm not doing enough. And then I think, I firmly believe that the bottom line for saving the world is the evolution of consciousness. And this is what you're contributing to in helping people to live more authentically. And that is a huge, somebody said the most radical thing you can do is be yourself or be authentic. I forget what the saying was, but it had to do with self-evolution. And I don't mean just self-care, although that's important, but growing,
Right.
the more mature we get, the less polarized we're going to be, the less destructive we're going to be, right? So I think the work that you do is activism.
Yeah, that was actually one of the last things on the list. Is I suddenly realized, my goodness, I've written 4 self-help books, and I've been in service journalism my whole career, meaning don't just tell them the news, tell them what they can do about it. And what is it that makes us forget these things to stick to an old storyline? So thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So what I want you to do is take a look at the story that you've chosen to focus on, and in the spirit of reality checking it, or doing what, I mean, Gloria, you mentioned Byron Katie. She refers to turnarounds. All right. Turnaround is an example of how the opposite of the story you're telling yourself might be true. So what I just want to invite you to do is take a look at the story you're working with and find some turnarounds. Any even minor exceptions to the storyline, you know, a time when in fact you were the smartest guy in the room, or a time when, you know, you did have a clear sense of what you needed to do with your life, or whatever the counter example is. So just come up with a list, if you can, of exceptions to the storyline and see what you come up with.
I have a question.
Sure.
So everything I'm thinking of is sort of results oriented. Trying to avoid that. Like if I believed that things were true, then these are all the things I would accomplish with this time. But I don't think that that's the point. So maybe I'm missing.
You don't think that that's what?
The point maybe of like, what are all the things I could do if I did have time, more time for myself. So I think maybe I'm missing, like, could you give another short example potentially? I understand we have to change the narrative, but or maybe I'll wait to hear other people's examples.
Okay, so I'm inclined to want to address your particular question.
Okay.
You're, if I'm understanding you, you're saying that you may be on the wrong track, that when you're thinking about time for me, you're thinking of all the things you could do with the time, which would be what? More doing?
Or that it would, if I did have more time for myself, I would be more relaxed. Or I would have more clarity and focus to go to my work with.
Okay.
So is that kind of along the right track, or is that being a little bit too like results oriented?
Well, yeah, it's hard. It's really hard not to be results oriented. I mean, it sounds like if you were, let's say, to bundle into an average day, 15 minutes of me time, inviolable, no one will put asunder, including yourself. And what do you imagine, just off the top of your head, what do you imagine you might do with an extra 15 or 20 minutes that's just carved out for you? What do you imagine would be the best thing you could do with that time?
Probably meditation, journaling, that kind of like self-reflective time. And I mean, I do journal, but oftentimes I feel like I do it in a fury or like quickly on my phone or something, not like actual like dedicated time to just write some things down. Right,
do real free writing. Okay, so meditation seems like more along the lines of what you would like to do, because what you want to drop down to a deeper level inside yourself, not be doing things necessarily.
Right, to ground myself.
To ground, okay. Yeah, so then I would be inclined to ask or even suggest that you make a list of in how many ways can I ground myself? And I'm phrasing it that way deliberately because I'm a student of brainstorming, and the way that things are phrased in brainstorming is in how many ways can I, not what is the solution to this problem, but in how many ways can I or do I ground myself? So that could include meditation. It could include time in nature. It could include contemplation of the bigger picture. It could include making music, right? It could include touch. You know, if there's somebody in your life who you can ask, just give me some non-sexual touch, because that tends to be one of the things that grounds me, is get into my body, get out of my head, all right? Because I can climb up there with the best of them. So it might just be a list of things that help ground you. And you can pick and choose from them throughout the day if you happen to have even a couple of minutes of quiet time. Is walk outside and look up. Don't do anything more than that, and see what comes into your field of vision. Birds, airplanes, clouds, drones, whatever. So that would be something I would be inclined to suggest, is to ask what it sounds like what you're really wanting for this me time is grounding, because otherwise you're doing the fibrillating 10,000 things. You know, this is not what you want. You want a moment of just like calm, grounded. What does that for you would be where I would go if this was my issue.
Thank you.
So does that respond in a way that's useful for you?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Cool. Wonderful. Thank you for asking.
Kara had a comment in the chat about our activism conversation. She said the most potent activism is quiet and internal.
Yeah, that's counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who said that? Kara?
Kara, my other daughter.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask her.
She's not, her video isn't on. She's right
Oh,
here.
I see. Yeah, I was going to ask in what way she thinks activism, quiet, internal time is activist. I don't know if Kara, you feel like weighing in, but.
Sure. Yeah, I think in, most models, I mean, Mandela in his years in prison, Dr. King in his, nonviolent, I mean, so many great leaders of activism, male and female, have modeled that, and I think many unknown activists, it's just resistance comes, I think, much more prevalently in the small quiet moments that we have individually and collectively, where we choose, like taking a rest in a grind culture where that's forbidden, because we're supposed to constantly 24/7 be feeding,
right,
into the corporate labor, and just there are a million quiet small ways that we choose something other than the status quo. And that can set a ripple and a tide for much more lasting change than hitting the streets. I mean, all of it's important, but I think we mistake what real activism is and what it's for and how it works.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful point. I think there's undoubtedly a reason that spiritual traditions always come down to suggesting that people sit down and shut up. As part of the discernment process, as part of the spiritual process is, okay, the Bible says it nicer than that. They say, be still and know. But there's something really important about the external work that we do in the world, the activisms, the ministries, the teaching, whatever we offer gift-wise to the world, in order to even clarify what that is, we have to go inward. I was also thinking that, I hope you don't mind me saying so, Sharon, but that in response to your question about knowing what's right for you to do next, the inward part is as important as the outward part. Because first, the discernment process requires us to be quiet and to listen, and to just to be able to discern what's right for us, how to be in right relationship to us and to the world. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that's really key. Somebody had asked earlier about how you discern the stories that you tell yourself, in addition to just starting to pay attention to yourself or maybe journaling. This requires discernment. And a lot of this is going in and just listening to what the storylines that are going on in there, just to listen to that. I even suggested in my response to that question on the chat was, I have actually asked friends, tell me what you hear me saying. Tell me if you hear any things I say that sound like a story, a story. So sometimes the discernment process means going outward and asking for other people's ideas, not just my own. So thought I would mention that.
Yeah, I like Andrew Harvey's book, The Hope. It's about the hope. It's about what he calls sacred activism.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of spiritual people, people who are spiritually oriented, who, meditate every day and stuff, a lot of them don't want to have anything to do with the outside world. It becomes a very solitary thing. Yeah. They don't want to, I can't watch the news. It brings me down, it's too negative. And I don't think that is a good way to be, because the world needs all of us, right? On the other hand, a lot of people who do activism are coming from a place of anger, frustration, fear, and that just adds to the problem energetically. And so it's the combination of the two, and this is what he talks about in that book, is that if it's a heart-centered, what I call a heart-centered activism, that's combining the two. It's coming from the heart, not from anger and emotion.
Yes. Right.
That will do more good than raging and
Right. And I sometimes even wonder if people who are have devoted their lives to meditating on mountaintops, are they doing sometimes I believe that they're doing as much activism for the world as I am by walking down the street with a protest sign in my hand.
It could be. It all depends on where you're coming from,
exactly. Right?
Yeah.
So let me shift over to the last section that I would like to address, and that is reframing. Part of turning a story around is not just identifying the story, but actually relanguaging it. All right, this, I guess, would be the logic behind affirmations for some people, those who do that. But it's rephrasing it to emphasize a slightly more positive, or maybe a radically more positive view, and then repeating it to yourself over and over, because part of the power of stories is the repetition. We just grind them into our brain with repetition. And I suppose it's, what is it? Newton's third law of motion, equal and opposite reactions. If you've told yourself the same story 500 times, you may need to tell the new story to yourself 500 times before it begins to sink in and hold sway, right? So to some degree, I think that the reframing of storylines is a numbers game. And in fact, I just ran across a very useful piece of software. I don't think it's new, but I just ran across it. It allows you to plug into your own computer a subliminal message to flash at you however many times a day you want it to flash at you subliminally. So you can put a new storyline or an affirmation or some positive thought, plug it into your computer and subliminally flash at you throughout the day. And from what I gather, subliminal messages are quite effective at changing behavior. There's actually some science behind that. So I just thought that might be a useful piece of technology to, apply to the cause of changing a story.
What is it called?
Well, this wasn't particular. It's just subliminal software is what I Googled.
Subliminal software.
Yeah, and it's kind of remarkable. It scares me to think what an employer might do with it if he or she plugged in, you are happy with your present pay scale or something on all the employees' computers. That makes me nervous. Here's some examples.
Maria said in the chat, subliminal affirmations.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, I see. Is that something to Google?
I guess so. She's a big Googler.
Oh, I love it. It's an app.
Okay.
There are apps. There's an app for everything. I love it. So some examples, just to prime the pump again, of reframes. And these are a few from other people. I think one of mine, instead of "I'm not good enough," which is a storyline I've heard quite a few times in sharing this material with people. Instead of "I'm not good enough," she said, "I am good enough, but I'm struggling at the moment."
Mm.
And that's a compassionate way of saying this story.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of compassion in there. Here's one from a friend of mine. Instead of "I don't practice my music enough to improve as a musician," she wrote, "I've hosted music jams at my house every Sunday for 5 years, and it's gotten me to improve as a musician and made it more fun to practice."
Mm-hmm.
So there's a rephrasing of a storyline. Instead of "I don't practice enough to get good." All right. And this is one that I wrote around the "I'm a lone wolf" story. I wrote, "I love being in thriving community, and I'm actually fairly good at helping to create that. And I love solitude. Okay. And I want to create a healthy balance between my introverted and my extroverted sides." And I like this much better than "I'm a lone wolf." Somebody once told me that heroism redefined for the modern age, he said. Heroism, or heroinism, of course, redefined for the modern age, is the ability to tolerate paradox, to hold to seemingly contrary ideas or impulses or beliefs inside you at the same time and still retain the ability to function, if not hang on to your cookies and your marbles and your lunch. Right? But there's something about holding the tension between my introverted and my extroverted side that just feels like a much healthier storyline to me than choosing sides. I'm a lone wolf. A friend of mine recently gave me a graduation present in this department by saying, "You know what you are? You're an ambivert." I never knew there was such a word. Ambivert. Extroverted, introvert, like ambidextrous. And I just love that. So here's one of the last things I'm going to ask you to do. Take a shot at your own story, the one you're working on. How might you rephrase it to focus on something slightly more positive or considerably more positive? All right. Is anybody inclined to share a rewrite with us? A way of taking the story that you've been working on and rephrase it. Yeah,
There
Sharon.
are always enough. There are always enough hours in the day to do what's most important.
Okay. I have enough hours in the day to do what's most important. Wonderful. How does that feel to say that like that?
It just reminds me that, you know, what I choose as my priorities is the important thing, not so much the hours in the day.
Got it. Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, Sharon.
Yeah. Okay. I enjoy helping others as I'm learning to set boundaries. I'm a poor boundary setter. I just always say yes. And even if I don't really want to do it, and also have a little bit of, I think it was Janice and me, where you get overwhelmed at times and then you kind of start taking it out on the person you're helping, and it doesn't feel like I'm enjoying it at all.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
That ring a bell, Janice? Yeah. Wonderful. So say it again, Sharon.
I enjoy helping others as I'm learning to set boundaries.
Beautiful. All right, wonderful. Yes, anybody else? A rephrase? Yeah, Janice.
So I always have time for myself because I'm always with myself.
Okay.
Whenever I choose, I can even just take a breath just for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. I can even just take a breath just for me. Oh, that's a wonderful reframe. Right. You know, it sort of reminds me of, this may be a stretch, but maybe not. You're familiar with the name Viktor Frankl?
Yes.
Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's a classic. And it grew out of his experience in the concentration camps in World War II. I see, look at that, we have a visual aid. Gloria's screen. Great. I love it, immediate gratification. And his point in the whole book, I think, is that the one thing that cannot be taken from you is your power to choose how you're going to respond to whatever life throws at you. And so your comment sort of reminded me of that. I have the choice, no matter how crazy and busy everything is, to take a breath just for me. And I love that, because it's taking some of the power back from a very insistent world, and a world that, as some of you have already commented on, is not particularly friendly to kind of taking time out, chilling, relaxing, just sitting with your mouth hanging open, for God's sake, you know? So anyway, I love that. That was beautifully put. All right, here's the last one. I want to be sensitive to our time. This may actually be something you want to spend a little bit more time writing on your own, but here's the last piece. One of the most famous symbols of the process of transformation, famous to the point of cliche, frankly, is the cocoon, okay? And from the outside, it doesn't look like much is going on in there. I mean, talk about a neutral zone symbol. This is a great one. Doesn't look like a lot is going on in there, but that is so profoundly not the case, as we know. What is actually happening in there is that the caterpillar's body is literally dissolving, okay? Yeah. This is, the more I think about this, the more perfect this is as a neutral zone notion, but it's literally turning into caterpillar soup. But what that process releases are what scientists call imaginal cells. And I just love that. I love that to death. And imaginal cells, they are what do the transforming of literally one creature into an entirely other. Okay, so in this last question, I guess, and again, just given the limitations of time, let's not do this now, but consider it as extra credit or follow-up assignment or something. Use your imaginal cells and apply it to the story you're working on. How do you imagine your life would look or could look if this new storyline took hold? All right, just to imagine into it, and what might it look like? What might it feel like? What might emerge or evolve as this storyline really begins to sink in and take hold, and the other one begins to fade. All right. So just something to consider is really just take some time and imagine into what your life could look like once the storyline shifts. So I just thought I would mention that. And in the spirit of ending on time, we've got, according to my clock, 2 minutes. So anybody have any last comments or questions or anything you want to share you haven't gotten to share?
So I haven't spoken for a while. I just need
Sure.
to say I have about 5 stories, and honestly, I think one of them was about being an imposter syndrome, right? And what you just said is just so amazing to think about. Imagine if that wasn't the case. I just think this is brilliant. Thank you so much, Gregg.
You're most welcome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Wonderful. Anybody else?
I wanted to share that my mom always used to say to us when we would get frustrated or mad at somebody or frustrated with even like ourselves or a situation, that we couldn't change the other person. We could only change how we react to it, like our reaction. And in changing our reaction authentically, like you said, changing your story, very often it shifts the entire situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm learning that in something called nonviolent communication. Some of you may have heard of NVC. And the idea is you're in a conflict with somebody, quit focusing on what they're doing or not doing. Quit focusing on trying to change their mind about what they're perceiving about you. Quit focusing on content, stick with yourself. And it's amazing the kind of transformative effect that can have on a conflict when you just take responsibility for your portion of the show and just focus on, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I really need, here's even a request I have for you. But just to keep it here, and it's like you said, it's really the only thing you do have control over. You know, you don't have control over what other people do or say or even perceive. And anyway, Viktor Frankl's work, the one that Gloria held up, it's a brilliant piece of work and it's really spot on. Anybody else? Yeah, Tara.
Tara, unmute.
Just one other thing I thought of during this exercise is like my original idea, my main idea was about perfectionism, right? And sometimes when I'm meditating and I'm really kind of like getting deep into this state, I kind of think about what I would change if I were to like be reborn again in my next life, right? And that's a drastic thought, right? I'm like completely done with this life and wanting to move on to the next. And what would I change? Normally I think about this perfectionism thing. Like, I don't want to be a perfectionist. I just want to like live life the way it is. And then I think, why do I have to wait for my next life? Why can't I start now?
Right.
So I guess that's like a drastic kind of train of thought, but it does help to think like, all right, I can start now. I don't have to start a brand new life to work on this for myself to be successful now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's critical to be able to do it now. It's one of the concerns I have about the belief in an afterlife. It's like, well, why should I, do now what I could put off till the next century? And, that's kind of worrisome to me. But that's only because I have a belief that this is my time in the game. That doesn't go for everybody, and I know people have different beliefs around that. But this is our time in the game, is my sense. And to the time to design and redesign our lives and our stories and our experience of this beautiful, incredible life is now. And we don't have to get it perfect. I come from a long line of perfectionists. It is a pain in the ass. I can vouch for that multi-generationally. And it's a losing proposition as well.
Yeah, it's a recipe for failure.
Yeah, it's a recipe for profanity around the house. All right. So Gloria, thank you so much for inviting me to share my work with your beloved community. And I really want to thank you guys for showing up as beautifully as you did today. All you guys, thank you for your shares.
Thank you.
And your
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.
You.